Morning, everyone. My name is John Barr. I'm with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. I'm here with Linda Larson and her team with the University of Illinois, who we're happy and appreciate their assistance in coordinating the logistics for the webinar this morning. Abby and Linda, are there any housekeeping items that we want to go through before we get into the content?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good to have you all here. We are recording this webinar, so we'll be posting it if you need to review the slides later, so just be aware of that. And I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can ask them in the chat and I'll try to answer them during the presentation. But if I don't get to it, we'll post answers to the question through our FAQ page, and I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. Thank you.
Great. And again, thank you for your support and coordinating these information sessions. So I'm going to jump right in because we have quite a bit of content to cover. And I know there are organizations out there, and you as administrators who may have attended presentations like this before that go over some of the more administrative and technical requirements of grants and submitting grants to the state of Illinois. And so primarily today, we will be focusing around the submission requirements under the Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Act within the context of the CEJA Climate Works Pre-apprenticeship grant program. But I would say that the information that I'm going to share today has been shared with other grant programs and other potential applicants. So if you've been engaged with Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, you may have seen this information before, but it's always a great opportunity to have the information reinforced and refreshed. And as Linda mentioned, we'll be recording this session. And so if you have other team members that want to come back to this information, certainly a resource. And that's really the point of all of these sessions, is to provide the support for potential applicants of the program, either for this Climate Works application, or maybe there's other future either CEJA or other funding opportunities that you might be interested in. The concepts that we're going to go through today and highlight are really applicable to any grants. I would say that this presentation is going to focus on the pre-award requirements, again, focusing on a workforce grant, but you could argue they could be applied to any grant with the Department of Commerce. So the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act was an important piece of legislation, and the intent there is to standardize some of our operating procedures. Number one, it was intended to help grantees so they would have a more of a uniform set of rules and rules of engagement in working with the state with applying for grants. So we're standardizing a lot of our procedures. And also, importantly, we're standardizing some of the tools and procedures around the accountability of state grant funds, and whether they're federal pass-through or whether they're state general revenue funds or whether they're CEJA funds, wherever it is. I think the intent was, we are providing public grants, and we have a responsibility to safeguard the public funds to make sure that they are implemented, or the projects are implemented, up to certain standards. And so you'll hear a lot about, GATA. So when I say GATA, I'm referring to the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, which essentially are, taking the federal grant making standards and bringing them back to Illinois and saying any grant that the state provides, we're utilizing the federal standards outlined in the Uniform Administrative Requirements, or 2 CFR 200. Today, we're going to talk about, one of the most important steps, a potential roadblock or stopping point for your grant application is if you were not what we call pre-qualified, right? So any organization that wants to obtain a grant from the Department of Commerce or any other agency must be pre-qualified. So that means that you have to register yourself with the state. So we have to know that you're an entity of, your organization is established, that you are also pre-qualified, and we'll talk about that in a second, that we have what's called a internal control questionnaire, which is basically a risk assessment about your internal organization, about the staff and your fiscal and management procedures. Again, the state wants to ensure that your organization is at a point where you're able to meet the requirements of administering a state grant. We know that those requirements can be somewhat sizable, but what the point of this session and others is to help maybe those organizations that are not exactly there yet, is to, if that's an interest, to help you along that path to get you to the point where there are fewer risks within your internal control questionnaire. And so just because there are risks that are identified in that type of analysis doesn't mean that you're excluded from a grant necessarily. It just means that we may need additional reporting or other controls around the administration of the grants to make sure that we are addressing some of the risks that may be identified. Okay. There's also a program risk assessment, and then there's mandatory disclosures and conflicts of interest. We all are aware of the news and aware of the importance of transparency within the administration of public grant funds. And so that's a duty that we take very seriously as well. And that's why there's additional disclosures and conflict of interests that are required as part of your application. Okay, so how also want to talk about your some of the financial requirements to obtain a grant and to charge that grant indirect costs. You would be required to register within the state's GATA portal. You would have to be registered and include an indirect cost rate. And we'll talk a little bit more about indirect costs during the presentation. But the key thing to take out of this slide is that if you are brand new to grants in Illinois, you would go to this website and start the registration process. The portal has a number of separate tabs where you can work through the process of getting yourself a state of Illinois ID that is authenticated. Then you can go through the registration process. You'll go through a pre-qualification process, and then we'll work with you on the fiscal and administrative risk assessment, or that internal control questionnaire. And then another process is going through this centralized indirect cost rate system. And again, that is part of the fiscal management of the grants, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the grant registration, as we mentioned, you go to this portal and you complete the registration process that will trigger some automated pre-qualification verifications. So I would strongly recommend that organizations coordinate this with their kind of their chief financial officer, or the individual who is implementing those duties, or has that role and responsibility within the organization, right? So you don't want just a program manager who may be, maybe further down the org chart a bit. So this process should be done in coordination with your management, because you're going to have to identify someone who is an authorized representative of your organization, who will get some very important correspondence and messages from the GATA portal, and talk about your registration and your process, and providing annual updates to the portal, right? So just, you have to think about, if you are interested in administering state grants, this is part of your business practice that you have to assign your fiscal managers, to make sure that your registration is up to date, and that they're responding to messages from the system. So part of the next step is the pre-qualification process and the uniform guidance. And again, a uniform guidance kind of drives what GATA requires. It requires these items listed. You must have a sam.gov account. You must have a federal unique identifier number. For those of you who may be coming back to the grants world, it used to be called a DUNS number. You have to be in good standing with the Secretary of State, not on a federal excluded parties list. And you get on that list if you had a grant go south with the federal government. Not on the stop payment list with Illinois, same thing. If you were, perhaps you had a grant and it didn't go well, you may be on a stop pay list. And then if you're not on the DHFS provider sanction list. So all those things, all of these elements are linked to databases, and there's a process that electronically checks your status with each of these indicators, I think in real time, or at least on a nightly basis, right? And so it's critical that you get this pre-qualification, right? And I would point out, if you look at page 14 of the notice of funding opportunity, you have to be registered in that portal at the time of a grant application. There may be some specifically within the sam.gov, there's some ongoing technical issues with that. We may have some flexibility with that as it relates to in good standing versus, still pending. But the bottom line for all of this, the bottom line takeaway is that you must be you must register, at the time of your grant application. So if you're planning to apply for this opportunity, get a plan in place next week. Sit down with your team members and review the process of getting registered and pre-qualified.
John, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Please.
So there's people asking, do sub-grantees or subcontractors need to be GATA pre-qualified? Can you please address that?
It's a great question. The answer is no, they do not. So it is only the applicant that is required to be pre-qualified, although I would say that a subcontractor or a sub-grantee is required to live up to or meet the standards of all of the terms and conditions that are outlined in the master grant award. So the grantee or the applicant, right? It is your responsibility to make sure that all of your subcontractors or subgrantees are in compliance with all of the requirements that we're going to talk about. So don't have to be registered, but you as a grantee are saying that all of your subcontractors meet the GATA standards, right? So, and we can talk about, maybe some tools around, how does that actually work on a practical level? Any other questions, Linda, at this point?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, very good, sure. And so as I noted, you'll get a message, automated message saying, hopefully that you're qualified, no issues. There are issues, they'll indicate what those are and provide some suggestions on how to address those. And if you need assistance on that, Department of Commerce could assist to the extent we're able to. Some of these things you may have to work with the Secretary of State's office, but we could at least point you in the right direction for some of these. As it relates to the federal excluded parties list, that is something that we can't help you with, because that's a done deal, and you will have to wait until you are off of that list to be considered for funding. Okay, so the next slide talks about that fiscal risk assessment or that internal control questionnaire, right? This is something that as you work in the GATA portal, you will complete. It's a survey, right? That will ask you questions about, what does your staffing structure look like? What are your accounting policies and procedures look like? What are your audit policies and procedures? What does your accounting system look like? So when you as an organization, again, recommend your fiscal officer or CEO or whomever has the broad organization in mind when they are responding to the internal control questionnaire, you're looking at an agency wide perspective, not necessarily just the administration of this project. Okay, so this internal control questionnaire is completed on an annual basis. And so once you get registered, just put it on your to-do list, because it is something that is updated every year, because we know that your organization can change and evolve. It can be become more complex, or it could you could lose staff and have a real impact on your overall administration. The second piece is the program risk assessment. And this piece is really more focused on the grant program that you're applying to. So for this CJA program, the program risk assessment actually will be sent to you by the Department of Commerce. That is not the program risk assessment only, is something that we will send to you, and that is after you submit an application. Okay. So again, fiscal risk assessment or the internal control questionnaire, everybody does that, every applicant on an annual basis. Program risk assessment is really more focused on those applicants that are moving forward in the grant negotiation phase of the grant making process. Okay, so make a note, program risk assessment, something that you do not have to complete at the point of application, but something we'll look at when we negotiate your award, if you're successful. And then the risk profiles will be determined, right? So we'll take a look at your organization and say, hey, are you, if you meet all of the standards and requirements, then, risks may not be, there may be no risks that have to be addressed. But as I said, perhaps you've had some turnover, or perhaps your accounting system isn't as robust as we'd like to see. That risk would be identified, and we would have, I guess you could call it corrective action, right? So items or activities that you would implement to control for the risks, and those that information, both on a fiscal perspective and a program perspective, would get documented right in your grant agreement as part of those terms and conditions. So that's the whole idea behind this, is to make sure that we take a an overarching perspective of your ability to be successful, in administering these grants from an organizational standpoint. Okay, so I talked about this indirect cost rate, and I could go into like a whole separate section or presentation around indirect cost, but what I can tell you is that indirect costs are basically, some people may generally define an indirect cost as like an overhead cost. It's basically it's a cost that can't really be attributed to one program versus another. So let's say you're a nonprofit organization that runs 10 different programs, and you may have an accounting office, or you may have you could have like a photocopier, right? And it doesn't make sense to say, well, this program, program one should charge the copy machine, $100. Program two should charge it $50. The idea is that level of detail and accounting is over the top and burdensome, right? So the idea is that an indirect cost rate would cover those specific overhead costs that really it's not reasonable to point them to a direct program, right? And so under the regs, there's a couple of different ways that you can handle indirect costs, right? You could utilize your federally negotiated indirect cost rate, and your fiscal folks would know this, right? They would know for sure, because there's a whole process of identifying what a negotiated indirect cost rate is, right? So many organizations who have direct federal grants have a federal rate, right? If you don't have direct federal grants, you might have a negotiated rate with the state of Illinois. Not as common, right? But I would say probably the most common approach is to utilize the 10%, what's called a de minimis rate, right, of the modified total direct cost. So again, that's the most common, 10%, kind of that overhead. But it's important to note that it's not just 10% of the full grant, right? So if you have let's say you have $100,000 in costs, and you're going to say, all right, well, 10% indirect, right? So it's a total 110,000, right? Maybe it would depend if that full 100,000, all belong in that that cost pool, right? So there are certain things like providing training and providing supportive services that you can't include in your indirect cost base. And so, like I said, I don't want to go into a ton of detail, because that could be a completely separate presentation, but know that there is a worksheet within the standard budget template that we're going to go through that helps you with this calculation, and that we're also here to help if you have questions. And I would also say that if an applicant incorrectly calculates their indirect cost, we're not going to penalize you or throw your grant out. We will work with you to correct the issue to make sure that the budget is compliant at the point that we negotiate your grant agreement. Okay. So again, it is important, but it is not critical that it is 100% precise as it relates to your competitiveness of your application. Okay. And then finally, you could always elect, I'm just going to directly charge my administrative costs and all of the other activities within the budget. I'm not even going to worry about this whole indirect thing because you've scared me off. Not my intent, but there are organizations who said, we're just going to directly charge because, hey, maybe we only maybe this organization only has 2 programs and all of our activities can be distinct and charged directly to those programs, and we don't need an overhead bucket. All right. So, again, I'm not going to go through these slides in a ton of detail, but there are other resources on grants.gov as far as FAQs and training modules. And if you are going to propose a indirect rate to be negotiated with the state, right? So you don't have a federal rate, but you want to, okay, well, I want to take more than the 10%, then that, just know at the outset, then you're getting yourself into a, which could be a complex process. Now, from a business standpoint, you may want to go through that, right? You may say, look, hey, I'm getting into the grant business with the state, and we've identified these indirect costs, and we need to recover those. And so it's appropriate for you to go through that negotiation process. That's handled outside of Department of Commerce. I believe they still work with a contractor like Kroll Harwealth is their vendor, who I think coordinates a lot of that. That may change, but so that's that process. So hopefully, a big sigh of release. We're done talking about indirect costs for now. I know that can be a tricky subject, and again, if you need assistance as you throw your applications together, we're happy to point you in the right direction. Okay. Want to pause, Linda, and see if there are any questions that are applicable, kind of appropriate to answer at this point in the presentation, or if we should kind of keep going.
Sure, thanks for asking. We did get a question coming in that says, once you elect to decline an indirect cost rate, can that ever be changed?
Yes, that's a great question. So you can, if you decide, you know what, for this CJA apprenticeship works, you know what, we're good. We're gonna decline a rate for this project. You can make that change. Now, I would say within the GATA system, right? Once you if you choose, because you'll have to go as part of your registration, you'll have to choose, how you want to operate, right? Big picture, right? For all of your grants. I believe one of the buttons is that, choose not to. You would have to go through that process with the GATA portal if you wanted to change your overarching approach. But if you in your registration process, right, had, select, no, I'm not going to take any indirect, but then when you apply to us and say, oh, I'm going to take the 10% rate, then we may have to have you go back to the portal and indicate the 10%. So you can always go, from the portal and say, well, I'm going to do the generic, quote unquote, I'll call that, that's just generic de minimis 10% rate. If you have that in place, you could always decide on a grant by grant basis, well, I'm going to decline any indirect, for this grant. And we're either going to kind of absorb the costs as, a matched or a leveraged cost, or just not take it and directly charge the grant direct administration.
Thanks, that's all.
Okay, very good. All right, so just want to point out that one of the new things, not new anymore, but a new feature from a context of 25 years of doing grants, right, is this catalog of state financial assistance. And the great thing about that, and would encourage you to go to this location and identify all the grants that state of Illinois agencies are posting, right? So the idea is, again, more transparency, more communication and knowledge about what is available, right? So I would definitely go ahead and bookmark that. So as far as what is required from every grant program that we operate, right? If it is a competitive award, we require that the opportunity be posted through this notice of funding opportunity. We require a uniform application for state assistance, a uniform budget template, and then we go and we're going to talk about a notice of state award, which is essentially your contract and other official notices about your grant award. As far as your CJA pre-apprenticeship program requirements, you may want to bookmark this slide or take a screenshot, slide 13 for a future reference. That this is just kind of the full list of looking through that notice of funding opportunity, all the things that you will have to include. So you use this as a checklist, right? So you got your application, your budget, your disclosures, an executive summary, your technical or narrative proposal, right? That goes through the capacity qualifications, documentation of need, the project plan, the budget narrative. I will say, and this may have been covered in other sessions, that it's important to note that these 4 components of the technical proposal, there is a direct correlation to the evaluation or review criteria that the state uses to review your proposals and make a funding decision. So if I were to be in your shoes, I would take those 2 sections of the notice of funding opportunities and look at them side by side. I'm a little bit more old school. I would probably print off both of those sections and put them actually side by side, because then you can see exactly when the application asks for information about your capacity and qualifications. Well, what are the review team questions that will judge your responsiveness to the questions around applicant capacity and qualifications, and so on and so forth, down this list. I noticed a typo there, and but again, in the attachments, we'll also require the proposed work plan, outcome summary, sample criteria, and then your staffing plan. And all of this information is posted in the NOFO, and also on the application website, and you can download all of the applicable forms. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of these resources as we wrap up here, depending on the amount of time that we have available. So moving on with the application, and just this part of the presentation is actually just going to provide you with some very high level suggestions. I guess you could argue that some of this information should be included in how to write an effective proposal. But again, for reinforcement purposes, the next couple of slides just talks about things to consider as you put your application together around your capacity, talking about the documentation of need. And we know that especially with CJA, there's many more resources that are included within the notice of funding opportunity. Definitely utilize those resources, right? And a competitive proposal would make note of those and make note about how you're looking at those eligible communities, and connecting your proposed activities to address the needs that are identified in those communities. We'll look at your operational plan, right? So how is so you identified the need. Did you do a good job identifying the need, community, and the populations within the community? And so how does your plan stack up against meeting those needs, right? So again, these are more for reference for your application development team. Again, these are things that can be common common elements that should be considered as you pull together applications. Looking at, again, I mean, this proposal requests a budget narrative, right? Because when I get to the uniform budget template, it's not exactly as intuitive as we would like. If I'm in your shoes, I think that there's a lot of confusion with level of detail that goes into a budget narrative on that Excel spreadsheet. So what we've tried to do in this application is make it very clear, and it is a scored section within your technical proposal is the budget, a budget narrative. And part of that is competitive proposals should demonstrate that there is a return on investment, right? A return on, and again, it doesn't have to be a formalized process that goes to Carnegie Mellon to be vetted and verified, but you have to be talking about, what is demonstrating that this is a good use of public dollars and it's meeting the objectives of that are outlined within the NOFO and the overarching program and law, right? Okay, so one of the forms that I'm going to show is this uniform application. It is essentially, it is like a cover sheet. It's something that talks about who you are as an organization. I would recommend you do these forms at the end. Focus your primary time on the technical proposal as well as those required attachments. But again, make sure that you don't forget to complete these other required forms, right? Standard forms. Uniform budget template. I'm going to go through this in more detail, but this is a standard form that is a beast. Those are my words, not officially the department characterization, but it is a complex document, and again, part of the whole GATA standardization process. Makes some agencies, we've had to compromise with like a standardized template across all agencies, and so we know from a grantee perspective that this can be an area that can trip you up. And again, it's not intended to be a barrier. Again, the key is to fully document in your technical proposal those costs that you're proposing and demonstrating that they're reasonable and necessary to the success of the project. We can work with you through the grant negotiation process on any of the technical issues that have to be corrected in the uniform budget template. But the key, again, is to identify the content, right? The content of what you're requesting. The intent is not to throw you out on a technicality in the uniform budget template, but it is somewhat complicated, and we will have to get it right if you are selected, to be a grantee. So there will be some back and forth, guaranteed, right? That unless you have a ton of experience working with state grants, there will be at least 1 or 2 rounds of back and forth to making sure that your uniform budget meets all of the requirements of our accounting office. All right, so and to that end, again, this is really talking to the substance and content of your proposal, right? It's key. It's that all of your costs, are allowable, right? And so within the NOFO, it talks about what costs are allowed, what costs, probably doesn't do as much of a discussion around what costs are not allowed, but I can tell you that the federal uniform guidance, does have a list of standards of things that the government just isn't going to pay for, right? We're not going to pay for lobbying. We're not going to pay for things that are not reasonable, and we'll get to reasonable in a second. We're not gonna, we're not going to pay for costs of your just general operations that aren't associated with the administration of the program, right? So it's got to be, what you're charging is got to be allowable. The next is they have to be reasonable, right? So you can't, as an organization, decide, well, I'm going to get government money, so guess what? We're going to charge. We're going to, we're going to, instead of just getting like a nice Ford Taurus, we're going to go with the souped up Escalade, right? So you're looking at what's a reasonable cost for achieving the program objectives, right? I always look at it as, if you are making a financial decision or commitment or planning, think of it utilizing your own checkbook, right? Or debit card, or showing my age again, right? So what's a reasonable? So, you treat these funds like you would treat your own, right? And that also includes um, 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 making sure that they are consistent, right? That they're allocable, right? So that you're not charging this grant for other activities that you may be running. So if you're in that organization that's running 10 different programs, that you're not just going to say, oh, I got this new Fiji opportunity over here, and I didn't get maybe these other two grants that we normally get, but don't worry, we're just going to cover our costs, because we're going to cover the costs from the CEJA grant, and all other operations will kind of continue to operate as normal. That's not allowed, right? The other thing is to treat your costs consistently, right? So don't just turn around and say, well, we charge grants. Let's say that you have your staff. Well, staff, let's say they're charged, your team $50 an hour. Just throw a number out in the air, but that's what they normally get paid, right? And that team member, you can't turn around and say, well, because they're getting paid with government money, they're going to get $75 an hour, right? So again, you have to treat a cost consistently, utilizing both grant and non-grant monies, right? So you can't just have you can't have two sets of rules as it relates to your overarching financial operations, right? Okay. I told you we weren't going to talk about indirect costs, and I'll live up to that, but just know that this slide is here for a reference, and that there's a whole lot of information that is out there to assist in identifying your indirect costs and applying that to the grant application. All right. So here is just an overview of the uniform budget template, and I'm gonna show you this in this once we get through the slide deck here. I would point out again, this presentation is meant for all types of grants. In your application, there is no match section. That is not required, right? So just there you go. Again, the section A talks about the state of Illinois funds. These are standard budget lines, and we use the definitions from the Federal Uniform Administrative Guidelines, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second. Section A does have a tab, so you do have to choose on every grant of whether how you're going to handle indirect costs. And again, most grantees either use their federally awarded rate, They use that 10% de minimis rate, or they choose not to deal with indirect costs. So just want to highlight some components and requirements if you are awarded a grant with the state, right? So let's say you submit your application, it's recommended for funding, we negotiate award. That grant document is going to include 30 plus pages of terms and conditions. These are just some of those highlighted requirements. So just know, again, the bar is it's a a very strong it's a strong bar, right? And it's not not intended to exclude, but it is at a level that includes a lot of accountability for these federal grant funds. And you would have a grant manager to assist you and also provide kind of technical assistance, but also their job is to monitor the compliance of your project and organization to the grant. So there is it's a partnership relationship, but again, know that part of our partnership is to make sure that we can help you comply with the requirements, and that really the communication is there so that there aren't any surprises once you get to the administration of the grant. Worst case scenario would be is like you've got a grant and it's just rolling along, and 2 years later it comes out to be formally monitored, and a monitor might say, well, you don't have X, Y, and Z, and that is a question or even a disallowed cost. Worst case scenario. Don't want to get there, right? So that's why communication is key at the outset, even at the point of application. We do have listed within the Notice of Funding Opportunity website and the DCEO website, we have a template of the terms and conditions, right? So you can have your legal and leadership of your organization, you can have them review our boilerplate terms and conditions so you can understand if this is an opportunity that you're able to commit to if your application would be successful, right? So other uniform grant agreement is what we're talking about. So again, uniform across all state agency is part one, right? So that may be the first 20 pages or so. Part two is the things that are additional terms and conditions that just DCEO place on all of our grants. And then part three might be an additional couple of pages of grant specific terms and condition. And so again, this is the website where you can download that uniform grant agreement and have that that conversation internally. Other substantive from a program management perspective, I've been talking a ton about what your fiscal administrative leadership considerations, but from a program management perspective, that's really what's shown here, talking about all of the key project specific details, right? So your scopes of work, your deliverables, the payment provision, performance measures, performance standards. And this last piece is, we talked about, hey, if you had any issues around your internal control questionnaire or your program risk assessment, we would identify those, right? To, say, hey, this is what the risk was, this is what we're doing to control for that risk. Here are some additional resources. Take them for, I would have your application and program team, take a look. They're, from DCEO. There are also some other general workforce development resources may provide you with some assistance in developing your application. And then also I would point out, very importantly, the application the notice of funding opportunity includes references to some critical resources And that information was put into the NOFO intentionally. So I would strongly recommend that you check out that information if you're not aware of it already, and make sure that your application is consistent with that background and those standards. And again, that's where competitive applications will really, will really shine above others. All right. And here's my contact information. So that is the kind of the high level slide deck. I want to take a quick pause here, and then I want to show you a number of these documents. We've got about 10 minutes or so left. So any questions in the chat or anything from the slide deck?
One question that came in was, can an indirect cost be included in part of the grantee match? And I don't know if that's matching funds.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, that could be. That. You could decide that, you know what, I'm not going to charge this grant indirect, but I'm going to use my other funds and other, indirect. I could charge you, let's say I have a federal rate of 20%. I could charge this grant 20%, but I choose not to, right? And I'm going to use that as a leveraged or a matching cost to make my project more competitive, right? Because say, hey, this is what I'm bringing to the table with this, is I'm not going to charge you indirect. And again, that could be an advantage, within your application. So the answer is yes. You would just detail that within the budget narrative. I would detail that within your technical narrative proposal, but also document that in the tab on the budget as well.
And just want to note again that this does not require matching funds.
Correct.
But again, I think what you're saying, John, is that you could suggest that as part of your budget narrative. Yeah,
absolutely. Yep.
That's all.
All right, great. So I'm going to start with the most complicated because I want to just provide those who only have the full time with the opportunity to see this. So this is the uniform budget template. Again, this is kind of the beast that I referred to. And so it's important to note that these are the allowable budget lines, right? And that these lines are going to be consistent with any grant that you get with the state, except for line 15A and 15B. That's important because those are unique lines to the Apprenticeship Works, the CEJA Apprenticeship Works program, right? So, important to take note of, what you're doing there, right? And so, from just a logistics point of view, it's important to note that you do not enter your costs here, right? So if you try to enter a cost there, you're going to get an error message, right? So the place that you go in and enter your cost would be on the tab, right? So hopefully you can see. I'll try to blow this up. Oh, no, I can't. You can't see the tab. Hopefully you can see down here these tabs, right? You can click through. So all of these budget line items, so personnel, fringe, travel, right? You'll see there is a tab for personnel, fringe, travel. So let's say that you have program manager, right? And let's say that they are at 80,000 and it's a year. And let's say it's going to be 100% of their time over 3 years, right? So you'll note that costs get loaded here. You'll also note that there is a box down here. So you would put in your narrative about program manager is required to, I'm not going to do it, but program manager is to, run the operation full, and then just give a sentence or two that outlines a high level justification of the costs. It's important to note that this is basically the highest level summary to justify the cost that you just put in this table, I would recommend you do a much better job of outlining those costs in your technical proposal. Competitive proposals would, right? You don't have to do like, chapter and verse as far as, detailing to the penny, but again, to that reasonableness of, yeah, I need a program manager who's going to be full time and responsible because they're going to drive this program home, right? So that's in your narrative. That's in your technical proposal narrative. And again, I would summarize that within this narrative box. Each of these budget line item tabs follows that kind of similar approach, right? You put in your costs and then you put in your narrative. That's a requirement. So let's look at that cost, right? We have 240K over 3 years. And if you look back to the summary, why didn't it work? It should automatically show up here, but for some reason it is not, of course, because we're in the presentation. But so picture, if you will, that cost that you just put in into the personnel line will translate. That's the only way that you can enter in costs on this summary tab, right? That's the location of where you put those costs, and we'll check on the technical issue in after the presentation. So another 2 tabs that I want to point out in this form, this is the indirect cost rate information tab. So this must be completed as part of your submission. So this is where you would choose, how are you going to handle those indirect costs? So again, just go through this, and if you receive a federal rate, you'll check that box. If you want to utilize the 10% de minimis rate, check that box. If you have a federal rate or a state rate, right, make sure that you complete this box down here. Okay. And again, we're not going to throw you out if you've got a technical issue on this, but it is something that we'll have to address if you are selected for an award. Another important piece of information on this form is this certification page. This is definitely important as part of your application, right? So you need to make sure that your chief financial officer or whomever is fulfilling those roles and responsibilities has reviewed this budget and also indicates their concurrence and signature. Now, I think that we've provided some flexibility, at least at the point of award, with electronic signatures. So we're asking both the CFO and then the entity or individual that is responsible and authorizing the organization to submit a proposal to make sure that they've reviewed the budget and sign off on it. Okay, so I don't have a ton of time to show you other parts of the uniform budget application, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the process that you go through in completing all of the forms. So use those tabs to navigate and document your costs. Actually, one other important thing that I do want to go back to, on this is, one moment. Okay, so it is on the industry focused tab and the supportive service tab. Okay, you'll note that when we started with the personnel costs, right, that you could basically just kind of fill in all of the detail here, right? You could put in the name of the either the individual and their title, right? On these 2 grant specific items, right? There's industry focused training. I would make a note for industry focused training and supportive services. These are costs that a competitive proposal will have, right? So the NOFO says these are the things that you're going to do, kind of bottom line, right? So it's important to note that we have 4 sublines that we want you to categorize all of your costs, right? So if it's a curricula cost, instruction delivery cost, a work-based learning cost, and a stipend cost. So again, we want you to, kind of utilize that technical proposal narrative to fully support and justify the costs, but this is the place where you can put those costs in an overarching bucket, so we can understand how each of those subcategories are broken out, right? So you could theoretically, I believe this will allow you to, no, it's not. So you can, within the narrative, you could talk about curriculum. Let's say you're doing 3 different curriculum development elements with your application, right? You can put the total cost, so you'd put, the 3, and then, let's say they're $10,000 each, and it's gonna, length of time, you can just put 1, right? So for every cost. So you would put in the curriculum development, you would put curriculum development costs include development of curriculum 1. It's going to cost $10,000. Curriculum 2 is going to cost maybe 15,000, and curriculum 3 costs 5,000, right? So do provide a bit of a breakout of the costs that go into these sub budget line buckets. Okay, so again, just think of it as a huge umbrella is industry focused training. We got a sub bucket that is just curriculum costs, just stipends, just work-based learning, right? Still need to know, even though you say, well, I'm going to do 100,000 in stipends. Well, I want to know, what is that? How does that break out? How do you get to that 100,000? Did you say, okay, well, we're going to do 2,000 workers times however long of the stipend period times whatever the rate is, right? So again, make sure you provide that level of detail. And then note that stipend costs are included in this budget line 15A. That was intentional. And supportive services, that the NOFO also includes definitions of these 3 categories, and that is also intentional. So go back to the NOFO, check that out as far as where you think your proposed activity and costs belong. Do your very best in that. It's essential, again, that you have a good narrative in your technical proposal around that. And I think the other forms that I will show you just very briefly are fairly self-explanatory, but I want to show them to you nevertheless. This is what that uniform application cover sheet looks like. Again, you can see it's pretty straightforward, right? But it is important that you have that that applicant certification, right? And it does have that name of an authorized organization representative. I will show you also some of the web pages for those that are able to continue on. I know we're a bit over here, but again, want to just show you and reinforce some of the resources that we highlighted in the presentation. Okay, so I understand if you have to drop off, but I'm going to just go through some of these resources. So this is the Department of Commerce page where the CJA notice of funding opportunity is posted, right? And so you can see that this is the place where you can download those forms, right? So that that uniform application that I just showed you, you can download that there, right? mandatory disclosure and conflict of interest forms. Those are required as part of your submission. Again, this is where you get those. Your attachments must use our attachment forms, right? And so complete those as part of your overall grant package. I want to also note that within this page, there are some additional resources, especially for those organizations that may be new to grants and submitting applications to the state. And so you can click on these as apply for funding, right? So that shows maybe some other grant opportunities that are available. But then also links to that grant terms and conditions, right? So that's where your team members can go and download our grant opportunity. Let me show you also as it hold on one moment. Okay. All right, so this is another page, the resource library that can tell you a lot more information about the Uniform Administrative Regulations, talk a lot more about indirect costs. Here's that catalog of state financial assistance. And here is our friends over with the state of Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Unit. And this is where, again, that gata.illinois.gov website. This is where you would go to start this whole process, right? So if you're brand new, you would go to this page and kind of follow the steps here. So if you want to start the process, the pre-award requirements, go to this grantee links, right? Follow the pre-award. Kind of all the information that we highlighted today is listed here. All the information about the indirect cost is provided there. Again, that listing of other state programs, there's a search engine that you can review there as well. So appreciate you all hanging in through the presentation. Just thought it important to actually show you some of the resources that were referenced. And I know that DCO is happy to assist with the process to the extent that we're able. Some of the questions that you may have outside of these sessions, we may have to put on a frequently asked question list just to make sure that the information that's provided is fair for everyone to see. And so with that, I am going to pause again to see if there are any final questions as we wrap up today.
I don't see any questions, but I do want to note that I put some information in the chat about our technical assistance workshop on the 9th of May, which will be specifically geared towards those newer applicants, the first-time applicants. So we hope you'll attend that. And we provided information on registering for that in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Great. Thank you all. Have a great weekend and best wishes.